Thank you for inviting me here to present my research. I will be speaking today about the possibility of the Rus Khaganate in the 9th and 10th centuries, a polity which blends characteristics of Norse, Slavic, and steppe nomad cultures. If versed in this subject, you might be questioning why I left off the apostrophe after the Rus in my title. This is an intentional omission, as Rus with the apostrophe indicates the early state of Russia, while Rus without the apostrophe indicates the Rus people. And I am not claiming in this talk that there is a Rus polity called a Khaganate, as some scholars such as Duchko have tried to argue, but rather looking at the early Rus people's relationship with the idea of a Khaganate via their contacts with steppe nomad groups, specifically the most powerful of them in the 9th century, the Khazar Khaganate. To examine this relationship between Rus and steppe nomad cultures, three developments within the Rus culture must be addressed: Islamic silver trade, Khaganate ruling tendencies, and steppe nomad warfare. Together, these evidences indicate a clear connection between the development of the Rus state and the deterioration of the Khazar Khaganate. In the 9th century, the Varangian Norsemen, mostly Spear and Gotlander merchants, traveled down the rivers of modern Russia, including the Napier, Don, Volga, and Kama rivers. They came in contact with a plethora of peoples, ideas, and lucrative trade goods. Most significant of these items to the Rus is the silver dirham, minted in the Abbasid Caliphate or imitated by Bulgar, Transoxania, and Khazar rulers. In 749, the Abbasid dynasty took power over the Islamic Caliphate, moving the capital to Baghdad. They began to mint coins such as the one pictured here on the left. The dirham on the right is one of these imitations, minted by the Khazar Khaganate. It looks almost identical to its contemporaries, with the Arabic inscription unaltered, except for the tamga. This twig-like clan or family mark is usually associated with Turkish or Mongolian tribes. These two mid-9th century dirhams are imitations, but have a more official context, as the Khazars replaced the Caliphate's writing with their own text, Ard al-Khazar, land of the Khazars, as well as replaced the Islamic creed, Muhammad is the messenger of God, found on Islamic coins, with Musa Rasul Allah, Moses is the messenger of God. Moses being the foremost figure in the Jewish faith, these coins help archaeologists and historians better identify when the conversion of the Khazar court to Judaism took place, sometime in the early 9th century, before 837, when these coins were minted. It is most likely that this conversion was not a bloodless affair, as there are several revolts recorded during this period, including a revolt of Maiar and Iranian elements of the Khazar Khaganate, which led to the movement west of these two groups, eventually leading to the establishment of the medieval kingdom of Hungary. Another interesting element to the coin on the right is the hole drilled through it, possibly allowing someone to place it on a string as a necklace pendant. This coin is not alone in adapted usage, though. To give an example, the Rus settlement of Gnezdovo in central western Russia on the Napier has a plethora of artifacts found in several hoards, which point to Slavic, Baltic, Turkic, Byzantine, Norse, and Islamic cultural confluence. As you can see in this image, many of these coins were turned into pendants by the addition of a bail, allowing them to be hung on a quarter chain. This and other archaeological evidence indicates that these dirhams became a symbol of elite power for the early Rus, wearing not only their wealth, but the very items which made them wealthy altered into jewelry. In the 10th century, Islamic geographer Ibn Fadlan describes the Rus as not only trading for these dirhams, but also giving pendants to their wives to indicate status. And though he describes these pendants to be beads, archaeological evidence from northern Russia and the Baltic shows that female graves have a number of these dirham pendants buried with them. So the question becomes, what were the Rus traders offering in return for these dirhams from the Bulgars and Khazars who served as intermediaries between them and the Caliphate? Slaves were certainly a part of this trade, but it is impossible to know how large a part they played, as archaeological evidence of ancient Mediterranean slavery is very hard to identify. What we do know that they were trading was pelts. Like the Canadian fur trappers and voyageurs of the 17th and 18th centuries, the Finno-Ugric tribes and Rus merchants brought an astounding amount of fox, beaver, marten, and sable pelts south to feed the fur hat frenzy, which took place in Baghdad during the 9th and 10th centuries. Kuna, a word derived from the Old Russian word for marten pelt, was a monetary unit in medieval Kiev and Rus. Ibn Fadlan notes that one marten pelt was worth 2.5 dirhams. Another Arabic writer, al-Masudi, notes thus of black furs usage in the Caliphate. Arab and Persian kings take pride in their black furs, which they value more highly than those of sable martens and other similar beasts. The kings have hats, caftans, and fur coats made of them, and it is impossible for a king not to possess a caftan or a fur coat lined with these black fox furs. This map shows the distribution of dirham coin hoards with a terminus ante quem before the 10th century. As you can see, the east coast of Sweden, particularly the island of Gotland, shows the greatest concentration. According to Tore Ganholm of the University of Uppsala, this is not the only close connection between the Gotland and the east, as he and other scholars believe that there was a trade agreement signed between Gotlanders and the Byzantine Emperor Leo VI in the early 10th century, as well as the Byzantine royal house having both Gotlander and Khazar ancestors. This map shows all dirham coin hoards from the 8th to 13th centuries, still with a concentration of dirhams in eastern Sweden, but also increasing in number in southern Sweden, Estonia, and northern Poland. As we see this trade explode, there is a correlation with the sphere of influence of the Khazar Khaganate, who in the 8th century took advantage of the power struggle in the Caliphate to expand their hegemony over other peoples north and south. Can you please silence your mic? Khazar influence reached its peak around 850, with the fortress Sarkel located on the Don River being established in 831. This kind of fortress building is not the norm for Turkic nomad groups, who were certainly influenced by Islamic and Byzantine practices. The Khagan asked Emperor Theophilos to send him Greek stonemasons to construct the city. The Rus, who toppled the Khazar Khaganate hegemony in the Pontic steppes at the end of the 10th century, also had a tradition of fortress building along important river routes. But their fortified settlements were much smaller and usually built of wood, as they did not have access to the stone building techniques of the Byzantines. The confluences between these cultures only begin here, though. To address the relationship between the Rus and the Khazars, let us next turn to the Annals of St. Bertin, a Latin account of the French court of Louis the Pious in 839. A group of travelers arrived to the court with a Byzantine envoy who claimed id est gentem suam, their whole people were called the Rus. These Rus, whom accompanied them, also claimed to be on an official mission of friendship from their ruler, who is titled Chakanus, Latinized Khagan. The Rus had traveled with the Byzantine embassy from Constantinople to avoid a perilous journey back to their homeland, likely an encroaching Pechening horde. The Byzantine Emperor Theophilos was invested in these Rus' continued journey, as he made the request for their passage in his letter to Louis. However, Louis does not believe them to be truthful, as they belonged to the people of the Swedes. Comperit eos gentis esse suenum. So they are detained until word could come back from Constantinople. Many scholars have used this passage to try to prove that there was a Rus Khaganate with the apostrophe centered around Staraja Ladoga in the Lake Ilmen region of northern Russia. However, the archaeological evidence does not support this claim, as the Norse settlement at Ladoga was very small at this point, with a larger Slavic population in the area. This and other Slavic elements along the river systems where the early Rus are said to have inhabited led many Russian and Soviet scholars to believe that the Rus were an unadulterated Slavic people. The debate between these two sides of Rus ethnogenesis is called the Normanist controversy. I, along with other scholars such as Marika Maggi, argue that the origins of the Rus lie within a plethora of peoples, though. The Rus at Ingelheim's Khagan was not likely of the Rus people, but a steppe nomad overlord of the groups of Slavic, Scandinavian, and Finno-Ugric merchants and settlers who moved into their sphere of influence, calling themselves Rus. As stated earlier, the Khazar Khaganate was the most powerful steppe nomad group within the area which these travelers would have had to pass through from northern Russia to Constantinople. As this map shows, a number of Khazar fortifications and urban centers. The Khaganate of the Khazars is the most likely candidate, the Khagan of the Khazars is the most likely candidate for the Chikanus mentioned in the Annals of St. Bertin. To corroborate this evidence, we next turn to the account of Ibn Fadlan and his fellow Muslim authors again. Ibn Fadlan's colorful description of an elite Rus burial is well known and has significant correlations with his and other writers' accounts of steppe Khagan burials, including Bulgars and Khazars. But within his account, he makes a clear distinction between the Rus being ruled by a king and the Khazars being ruled by a Khagan, never substituting these for each other in this context, though he does so when discussing the Bulgar leader. The most significant similarity between the Rus and Khazars rulers' description is the access to them, which is highly limited, as well as a system of dual rulership. One seemingly ritualistic or religious in function, while the second ruler is the one who leads their forces into battle. Their lead ruler, or king or Khagan, also has ease of access to female companionship and is surrounded by a large force of warriors. This large group of warriors later is known as the Druzhina of the ruler of the Rus, as the Russian primary chronicle describes. In the 10th century, the Rurikid Sviatoslav, pictured here, is described as expanding this band of warriors and taking them with him to his vassal states to exact tribute and make war. The Byzantine description of this ruler also make him seem to have taken on a look more closer akin to a steppe nomad Khagan than a Scandinavian konogar, being dressed in a kaftan and wearing his hair in a chub or sidelock. Also, there are a number of inscriptions naming him Khagan Sviatoslav, as well as one recorded inscription of his son, Vladimir the Great, with the Khagan title. The mid-20th century scholar Brutzkus argues that the administration of these Russo-Varangians took many of its terms and customs from Turkish origins, from titles of military and bureaucratic offices to weight systems. These include the use of the Turkish holy number of 40 to count by, over the duodecimal system of the Scandinavians. This all points to steppe nomadization of the Rus as they grew in power. So if at any point there was a Rus Khaganate, it was within the time of Sviatoslav, who acted and looked like a Turkic ruler, with this idea dying in his son's rule with his adoption of Christianity. Sviatoslav went on to plunder the Khazar capital at Itil, destroying their power and usurping the title of Khagan, which most closely means Khan of Khans than any other translation. However, Sviatoslav met an untimely end at the hands of the Pechenegs not long after this conquest. So if there was a Rus Khaganate, it did not last but for a few years. The final evidence I would like to point to is the presence of what has been identified by Charlotte Henderstjerna Jonsson as Magyar archer equipment from the 10th century at the Birka garrison in Sweden, as shown above, along with a reconstruction of what this gear likely looked like. These finds, along with a number of animal-style belt buckles, strap ends, and pendants, show that steppe nomad culture made its way to Scandinavia and was not limited to Rus territory. The goal of this presentation and my continued research into Turkic nomadic relationship with the early Rus state is to aid professors and students of medieval history to begin to perceive a wider global view of the Middle Ages. Also, with this goal in mind, my master's thesis explores this topic through historical fiction. The Turkic nomad polities of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages are still misunderstood and neglected much of the time, and still sometimes fall afoul of racial and religious prejudices. I hope to contribute to this discourse with my continued research, and I'm happy to announce that this article, which I'm presenting is lined up for publication next year. Thank you all for your time, and I hope you, if you do teach Middle Ages history, medieval history, you take the time to incorporate in elements of Turkic nomad and other marginalized groups of people. Thank you very much.
So my question is how, like in some ways, the argument depends on sort of I mean, as always, on the interpretation of the evidence, but also what you privilege a little bit in the interpretation. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, as a scholar, you would make decisions about, you know, what evidence you weigh more heavily or not. Does that make sense? Like, how does textual evidence count for you in relationship to archaeological evidence, for example, and so on? So
yeah,
I just kind of want you to hear a little bit how you think about this methodologically.
So because of, you know, this part of history being such a blank spot for a lot of people, there aren't many. It isn't much literature actually written about, especially the 9th century. The 10th century has significant more amount of writing coming out of it. But yeah, so to the validity of any you know, piece from this era, you know, is of like chronicle or geographers writing is certainly put into question. They all have certain fanciful things in them, and so generally what I try to do is take what we find within the material evidence and see what parts of that are mentioned within the textual evidence and see where they collide. As I mentioned earlier, we have evidence of these marten pelts being traded. We know they were traded. And then we have textual evidence of them also. So this is an easy example, but there's many others. The dirhams also, they're talked about within these texts, and then we find the evidence. I mean, so I think in any study of this era, in this area of the world, you have to bounce between the two. Does that make sense, Johanna? Like,
Sure.
and how do I say one is more important than the other is, you know, really, really hard. I don't know if there is one side more important than the other. They really work in tandem. And
No, I mean, that makes sense. And it sounds like you sort of take your lead from the physical evidence in some ways.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's Marika Maggi is a scholar that I follow, and she's from Estonia, and she has that's kind of her methodology, and some of the other people I mentioned also. So that's kind of, I guess, a more archaeological route to then take into the textual route.
Yeah, thank you.
I see Dennis Trout has a question also down below. You want me to? I'll read it out loud.
Yeah.
Thanks. Oh, yeah, Dennis.
Sorry. So that's, yeah, my typing skills show there, or my lack of them. That's supposed to be thanks. And is there archaeological evidence? I was just curious about that. Those are pretty elaborate coins that, if I understand, the Khazar mint must have produced in imitation of the Abbasid coins. Is there archaeological evidence for the mints?
I don't think there is one of the Khazars. There's one in Transoxiana, but that's a part of the, it's like a breakaway part of the Caliphate. They were part of it. They sometimes aren't. But I do not believe the Khazars have evidence of a mint themselves. We only have the coins, which are altered. So we assume there's a mint somewhere. So yeah, that's one of the issues always with the Khazars in any steppe nomad group, is that the archaeology is really, really scant because they don't build settlements until very late in this period. And then even then, we're talking about southern Russia near the Black and Caspian Seas, and this is not an area where funding goes very often, for one, but then also the settlement Sarkel I mentioned earlier was intentionally put underneath water for the building of a dam years ago, so it is not accessible anymore. So there's many sites that have also been destroyed.
Okay, great, thanks.